If you are wondering why this background is, not my bookshelf, I'm actually house sitting for someone right now, so that's why I have a slightly different setup, but hopefully that doesn't deter anyone. It's a white background. Very exciting. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beccasphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You have entered the weekly climate recap, where we explore what is being done to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So today we are going to be covering news from August 27th to September 1st. So let's go ahead and get started. In a memo to other U.S. Senate members, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said his office analysis concluded that the current spending bill and infrastructure plan would set the U.S. up for reaching 45% emissions reduction compared to 2005 levels by 2030, which would put us on track for the Paris Climate Agreement. And apparently, if then you were to add the April executive orders, it would bring us closer to 50% emissions drop. However, I'm a little skeptical on that part because the White House did just start releasing federal lands and coastal waters to fossil fuel companies, which was one of the executive orders, would be for them to stop doing that. So I'm not sure whether or not that statement was made before or after that executive order was kind of rolled over. But bottom line, these policies need to get passed, and the only way it seems like that's going to happen is if all Democrats are on board for this, because basically it's just going to get passed through party lines, because that's kind of what we've seen so far. Anyone want to prove me wrong? Feel free. And right now, the main Democrats at risk would be Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema from Arizona. Bottom line, if you are from either of those states, please bug them and just be like, hey, I love that you are supporting climate action. I am so excited for you to vote yes on the infrastructure package and on the spending bill. We are so excited to see that pass. Sorry to start it off a little politically heavy, but it's now or never, and we honestly don't know how those midterm elections are going to turn out. So there is a chance that if Democrats lose the majority in either the House or the Senate, then we would kind of be stonewalled from doing anything else in the future having to do with climate. So it seems to be now or never. Russia released its new climate plan, but it actually says that it's going to increase its emissions by 8.2% by 2050 and just offset emissions by planting trees, restoring wetlands, and reducing wildfires. They're the fourth largest emitting country in the world. So, firstly, it's kind of hard to obtain data on definitively saying how much carbon is being offset by doing things like planting trees and restoring wetlands. Experts have basically said straight up that you can't just rely on offsets to reduce your emissions, and you got to do them in tandem. And the Carbon Action Tracker calls their plans critically insufficient. Mumbai became the first city in India and South Asia to announce it's in process of creating a climate action plan. Mumbai's Climate Action Plan, or MCAP, will focus on 6 tracks: sustainable waste management, urban greening and biodiversity, urban flooding and water resource management, building energy efficiency, air quality, and sustainable mobility. They plan to complete their MCAP by COP26, and citizens are able to submit their recommendations to the panel by September 20th. Oh, I forgot to say earlier, if I'm looking down in this direction, my iPad's here, and that's just because I need to read off of it. Okay, let's keep going. India as a whole also does have a climate action plan, which was developed in 2008. I'll go ahead and leave a link to that whole report in the resource section below. The General Assembly for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, is meeting this week to talk about how to protect the world's flora and fauna. It will include representatives from more than 217 territories and nations, 18,000 experts, and 1,400 NGOs, businesses, and scientific institutions. And for the first time, it will also include 23 indigenous organizations representing every single continent. And they will be able to introduce motions, vote for or against resolutions and recommendations, and overall just have their voice heard more than ever before. Quote, "We have been fighting for 40 years to be included in the UN's international system and other international spaces to defend the identity, culture, and lands of Indigenous peoples. We know that if we don't go to international meetings, solutions will not come to us." The White House opened a new office in the Department of Health and Human Services that focuses on human health implications of climate change. Called the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity, the office will take a look at both sides, so both how carbon emitters are hurting human health and how climate change extreme weather events are hurting human health. The HHS secretary had this to say, quote, "The climate crisis is here, and the Department of Health and Human Services is rising to meet the challenge. We're going to use every tool at our disposal." The HHS requested $3 million from Congress for next year, but until then, they're going to draw from existing resources. Last week, we talked about the Permian Basin in and around Texas, where there's a lot of methane emissions being released by unpermitted flaring activity from fossil fuel plants. Well, this week, we're going to talk about Europe, specifically Romania. Romania is leading methane emissions in the EU via its oil and gas production infrastructure. Mainly, the country has a lot of old infrastructure, which ends up being vulnerable to leaking. This presents a local health problem too. Many of these sites have communities near them, and if you've seen my recent deep dive on fossil fuels and plastics, methane can disperse into local water systems to the extent where it can actually cause tap water to catch on fire. And there's also a lot of other dangerous chemicals that can leak from that infrastructure, like benzene and formaldehyde, both of which cause cancer. A Clean Air Task Force member, also known as the CATF, visited 26 oil wells and determined that 25 of them were leaking methane. Quote, "As we walked around, we could quickly smell the fumes from the wells. We assumed right when we turned the camera on, we would see some gas coming from the wells." And they did. And locals in those areas says that they always smell like that and that they're just kind of used to it. And there's a lot of kids living in those areas. While there are 50 methane leaking sites in Romania, there are also 150 others across 7 other European countries. The CATF foreign director had this to say about the larger issue, quote, "To be honest, there's no policy, no regulation whatsoever for this stuff in Europe. This is why the European Commission has to act. This is why the European Parliament has to act. There's no rules these guys are breaking." I'll leave the article in the source section below. It's really interesting. Highly recommend. Hundreds of sports stars in Australia signed an online petition called The Cool Down to ask the government to do more on climate change. The group had this to say, quote, "Like so many Australians, we've experienced the impacts of climate change firsthand. But at the moment, if climate action was the Olympics, Australia isn't winning gold. We're not even making the finals. In fact, we don't even qualify." Central banks can't seem to kick the habit of funding fossil fuels. They have supplied them with $3.8 trillion worth of financial flow from 2016 to 2020. None of the 12 central banks, which are from the US, the UK, the EU, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, China, India, Japan, and Russia, are on track to hit their emissions reduction goals. The only good news, I guess, is that we only know all this because they're being more transparent, and they also have been improving their reporting of climate-related risks. and many insist that they are on track of reaching their 2050 reductions goals for their facilities themselves. In response to the central bank's actions or inactions, hundreds led by the Extinction Rebellion blocked London's financial district and London's Tower Bridge for 2 weeks' worth of protests. The bridge has since been reopened with 11 people arrested. We often think that people over 50 are less interested in solving climate change, but a recent UK survey proves otherwise. 2/3 of British people that are over 50 years old want ministers to do more to mitigate and adapt to climate change, even if it means raising prices on things. The founder of the company Rest Less, which conducted the survey, said this about the results. Quote, "Our research shows that midlifers feel a huge sense of responsibility for the health of the planet and their role in reducing climate change. Many have been changing their habits to reduce their impact, such as driving less, eating less meat and dairy, and also reducing their home energy consumption." A new company, which started up on EVs, seems to really be building to stay. Rivian is backed by companies such as Ford, BlackRock, and Amazon, and it has raised over $10 billion. It is hoping for a $70 to $80 billion valuation around Thanksgiving, which, to give you a little context, Ford's market capitalization is currently around $52 billion. So if they get anywhere near $70 or $80 billion, that would be unheard of. Hurricane Ida. Yeah, you thought I wouldn't talk about that? Ah, come on. It's kind of like one of the biggest news points right now. Hurricane Ida touched down in Louisiana on Sunday as a Category 4, quickly becoming the strongest hurricane in Louisiana's history since Katrina 16 years ago. And by the way, it, I believe, hit Louisiana on Katrina's anniversary. So, yikes. Ida was stronger but smaller than Katrina, and it has now impacted Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, and now New York and New Jersey as a post-tropical cyclone. Central Park saw 3.15 inches of rainfall in 1 hour. Let me repeat that. They had over 3 inches of rain fall in 1 hour, which is almost a record. While the area is definitely not new to hurricanes, hurricanes are rapidly intensifying closer to landfall more than they used to, allowing them to last longer over land. Honestly, Hurricane Ida will probably also make record for the fastest extreme weather event to quickly be attributed to climate change, because before it even hit down, news organizations immediately started talking about climate change in the context of Hurricane Ida. I've never seen any extreme weather event be connected that quickly and confidently by news organizations before. So that could potentially be some good news coming out of it. Many of those news organizations basically pointed out that the Gulf of Mexico waters are basically like bathtub temperature. They're 85 degrees right now, which is several degrees above average for them, and that could have increased the energy of the hurricane, bringing about faster wind speeds and larger storm surges. Basically, if you want to learn more about how hurricanes are worsened by climate change, I did a video on that a little while ago, which I'll link in above and below for you to check out. Many parts of Louisiana, though, are now without power, leaving people vulnerable to carbon monoxide poisoning if they don't use heat generators correctly. Basically, don't use heat generators in an enclosed space. They're also running out of fuel in some places and even oxygen in medical facilities, and several medical facilities had to evacuate their patients before the hurricane hit. And some areas are also struggling to obtain clean drinking water. Bottom line, it's a mess over there. But it could have been a bigger mess over there than it actually was, because the levees, flood walls, and floodgates that let Louisianans down in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina actually held, thanks to the $14.5 billion of retrofits that happened after Katrina. That's not to say that nowhere in Louisiana flooded. There were definitely a bunch of suburbs that did flood, so that's still an issue. but the death count will be a lot lower than Katrina thanks to those retrofits. However, experts are concerned that this is just a temporary reprieve. Quote, "It does not mean that the lesson of Hurricane Ida is that metropolitan New Orleans has adequate hurricane protection. It means it had adequate protection against this storm surge. As the system is challenged by stronger and more frequent hurricanes, I think many experts are concerned about the rather low level of protection that New Orleans has." And while most fossil fuel plants batten down the hatches, as they usually do when hurricanes happen, environmental problems are starting to show up. So there might have been a couple releases of crude oil, fuel oil, and related chemicals from certain areas of Louisiana where there is a large concentration of fossil fuel plants and petrochemical sites. Which is another thing that I talked about in my most recent deep dive. Honestly, my deep dive, it was about plastics, but I did talk a lot about the issue of like fracking and petrochemical sites and health impacts of those things in Louisiana. So if you haven't seen that, definitely check that out. Louisiana just has so many things that are related to climate change that are hurting them right now. And to add to that, the National Weather Service has issued a heat advisory for many parts of Louisiana for Wednesday. And that is, again, keeping in mind that many Louisianans are still without power, so they will not have AC for that heat advisory. A research group headed by an oceanographer and engineer from the Southern Cross University in Australia is executing the world's first field trial to brighten marine clouds in an attempt to cool down the coral reefs and reduce coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. Cloud brightening, not coral brightening, because that's coral bleaching and that's bad. Cloud brightening is an example of the controversial geoengineering. Basically, the program is paid for by the $220,000 Australian Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, but scientists outside of Australia are concerned about the trial because there's little published about the group's work. But you can see what is known about their work by checking out the source in the source section down below, because there is some interesting information about what they have tried before. Massachusetts administration announced that it would spend $21 million on climate change resiliency projects through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, double of what they spent last year. 93% of communities have opted into this program. Quote, "The MVP program is a vital tool in our efforts to prepare and strengthen our coastal and inland communities to address the impacts of climate change. We are thrilled to welcome 16 new towns to the program as they take important steps in planning for the future, and to award funding to 66 priority implementation projects that range from upgrading or removing high-risk dams and culverts to investing in environmental justice communities." You might remember last week that the Biden administration opened up federal leasing for federal lands and coastal waters to fossil fuel companies after the fossil fuel companies and the American Petroleum Institute sued the administration for the executive order saying that he would no longer lease out federal lands. Well, now Earth Justice is suing the Biden administration on behalf of the Sierra Club, Healthy Gulf, Friends of the Earth, and the Center for Biological Diversity for reopening 80 miles of Gulf of Mexico waters to oil and gas companies. An Earth Justice attorney had this to say, quote, "This lease sale is deeply disappointing. The Biden administration has folded to the oil industry based on its campaign of disinformation and political pressure, ignoring the worsening climate emergency we face. Our planet cannot handle more stress from oil and gas production, and yet the Biden administration is plowing ahead with a lease sale that will have impacts for decades into the future." And speaking of oil and gas production, Sarawak Shell Berhad, I probably butchered that, sorry, a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell, is moving forward with the Timi gas project offshore of Malaysia, hoping for a peak of 50,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. The project claims to be green, though, because it will be powered by solar and wind power to reduce its emissions. I do feel so much better. Similarly, Indonesia approved the Ubadari natural gas field, which will pump out an additional 1.3 trillion cubic feet of gas beginning in 2026. That will include more pumped from the Vorwada gas field with the additional carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. They basically plan to recycle the carbon dioxide back into the process, reducing up to 90% of reservoir-associated CO2. And then CNOOC, China's largest offshore oil and gas producer, has announced plans to inject up to 300,000 tons of CO2 per year from its offshore production process 80 meters down into seabed reservoirs in the South China Sea. It's also increasing its green energy spending to 10% as it works to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Also in China, Sinopec Corp, Asia's biggest oil refiner, plans to spend $4.6 billion to produce more than 1 million tons of green hydrogen per year from now to 2025. It currently produces 3 million tons of hydrogen from non-renewable sources, so that would be blue hydrogen or gray hydrogen. There's other colors too, but those are the main ones. Black hydrogen, I think, too. That's from coal. I hope not. It has also built 20 hydrogen charging stations with plans for 60 more, and it plans to expand its solar power generation. Meanwhile, Madagascar is the first example of what is considered a climate change-induced famine. At least it's the first to be attributed to climate change. Around 300,000 people there are experiencing extreme food insecurity, with 1.1 million people experiencing at least some food insecurity, according to the World Food Program. This drought is in its fourth year now, which has been compounded by sandstorms that then cover and kill the crops. Scientists say it wouldn't be this bad if not for climate change, and they see South Africa experiencing similar effects in the coming years. This also emphasizes the unequal reality of climate change, considering Madagascar only represents 0.01% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. Quote, "Going by the statistics, over the past 20 years, there's been a 500% increase in the number of countries exposed to multiple types of climate extremes. We are seeing the effects of climate all over South Africa." Angola is also experiencing food shortages associated with climate change, resulting in many people there migrating to Namibia. California has closed all of its national forests due to wildfire risk. The closure started Tuesday and is expected to go until September 17th. And this hits hard for the national forests and park systems because they are usually quite busy during Labor Day, which is this Monday. The Calder fire has also forced South Lake Tahoe to evacuate, causing a huge traffic panic. New research out of the University of Chicago's Energy Policy Institute found that the average person is losing 2.2 years of life expectancy to air pollution. This number is definitely dependent on where you live. The worst place to live for air pollution seems to be India, where people can lose almost 6 years of their life expectancy from it. For Bangladesh and Nepal, it's around 5 years. The report contains new evidence showing that climate change is worsening air quality through things like wildfires. The U.S. Treasury, particularly the Federal Insurance Office, or FIO, is soliciting information on topics like data to assess the potential for major disruptions of private insurance in markets, especially vulnerable to climate change. This effort would affect the FIO's work with the states. The Netherlands Advertising Code Committee ruled that Shell misled customers with a carbon offsetting campaign that promised carbon-neutral fossil fuels to consumers. How, might you ask? Well, the campaign, called Drive CO2 Neutral, tells customers that for 1 extra cent per liter of gas, they can completely offset their vehicle's emissions by funding conservation projects in Canada, Peru, and Indonesia. But Shell did not have enough information to prove that this would actually offset emissions from using their gas. Unfortunately, though, the results are not backed by any law, but they basically just told Shell to pull out that campaign. A State of the World's Trees report found that up to half of the world's wild tree species are at risk of extinction, mainly due to deforestation brought on by agricultural practices. Madagascar has the most threatened species, with Brazil close behind. The 5-year international report's lead had this to say, quote, "Trees are essential. It's like a Jenga tower. Pull the wrong one out and the whole ecosystem falls apart. When I look at these numbers, I feel we need to act now." And finally, I'm going to leave you with a little action point. Ads Not Fit to Print is an activism campaign targeting the New York Times for running fossil fuel advertisements that are often full of propaganda and usually right next to journalism work, so it kind of looks like journalism pieces when they're not. Kind of like what I said earlier about the Axios thing, but I actually haven't seen a Chevron commercial from them in a little while, so that's good. And honestly, it's a shame because the journalists at the New York Times have been doing a really good job in covering climate news recently, so don't blame the journalists, but blame the company, you know what I mean? And so if you would like to help encourage the New York Times to stop doing that, then you can sign the petition, which will be linked in the resources section below. And you can also see where fossil fuel companies are also advertising by checking out the Instagram at fossil fuel ads. It looks like Politico also seems to really be having a problem with the fossil fuel advertising too, so maybe if the New York Times figures their stuff out, we should direct the campaign towards Politico. Anyways, until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. And I will see you all next time. Bye for now.